non-profit organizations in Gauteng are facing the possibility of their funding being slashed. Now, most have been warned to find alternative fund activities as they are no longer on Premier Panyaza Lesufi's priorities. According to the Democratic Alliance, those affected are in sectors such as older persons, persons living with disabilities, children and people living with HIV and AIDS. Joining us is Bernadine Bacher, Executive Board Member of the National Shelter Movement of South Africa, and in studio Angelique McAdam, Chairperson of the Gauteng Child Welfare. Very good afternoon to you both. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, Angelique, let's perhaps start with you. From your perspective, by the way, welcome to Newzroom Afrika.
Oh, thank you.
From your perspective, what's been the issue between the NPOs and the Gauteng province? Is there a danger of these funds being reprioritized?
To be honest, we actually experienced that in the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
And it is something that is extremely, extremely threatening. We did experience that. It was a notification that came at the last minute where budgets were seriously thrashed and some was not even paid. So with regards to your non-profit organizations, we definitely not only think that it's going to happen, it really happened to us. There were about 2 months, I was actually saying to the lady that was doing my makeup, I said to her, do you know what it feels like to lose your hair, literally lose your hair, because you don't sleep for 2 months, not knowing how you're going to feed the children, how you're going to be able to pay your staff, how you're going to provide for those people that are disabled, that are elderly. You know, as a chairperson of Child Welfare Gauteng, I'm sitting with affiliate organizations and social workers that we could not pay. And we could not actually open our doors to save children. There were a lot of children that we had to turn away or put on hold to protect them during that time frame. And how do you do that? How do you turn around to your staff members that are social workers that are already underpaid, I'm not going to lie, and your caregivers and all of those that you've got to say, well, we can't pay you this month. We don't know when the money's coming through, because remember, it wasn't only slashed, we didn't receive anything until this whole situation was being resolved. So it was very scary, not going to lie. It's so, between losing sleep, because as a chairperson, you know, and a board member, you are a volunteer. And you've got to be, and you're also the employer. How do you tell your staff, I can't pay you? You
Absolutely
know?
Catastrophic. I mean,
so it was terrible.
Yeah, let's bring Bernadine into the conversation. As an umbrella organization, Bernadine, that supports 95 gender-based violence shelters across the 9 provinces, how does this recent announcement that unused social services funds for critical services to vulnerable groups will be redistributed to other government departments? I mean, how does this impact your work? Listening to Angelique here, it really is catastrophic.
It is. Good afternoon, Paul and Angelique. And yes, it is catastrophic. And I share Angelique's concerns. I sit in the same position where, ironically, the Department of Social Development funds our social workers, and they actually pay their social workers almost double of what they are funding our social workers. Our social workers are finding it difficult to get to work. They are finding it difficult to afford to pay for petrol. So bleak days for NGOs across South Africa. But then we have these cuts in April 2023 that are announced in Gauteng. But that is juxtaposed with March 2023, when the Minister of the Department of Social Development goes and announces in a parliamentary committee that there's savings, in quotes, of 9.1 billion rand that wasn't spent of her budget. And how does one justify that? Who is holding her accountable for her underspending and for the funds that should have been going to NGOs nationally, for those funds now being distributed to other ministries? And we need to understand that NGOs are actually doing the work of the government. Section 27 of the Constitution sets out that the government is obligated to actually give social care services to vulnerable members of society. NGOs are actually doing that work. And then on top of this, we get this wholly inadequate funding models that are put into place across the board to NGOs. And then we have underspending, notwithstanding the fact that we have been crying for years now that we're not adequately funded, that we are facing closure all the time, and that we're sitting with the stress trying to keep the doors open. It's unconscionable and inexcusable.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Angelique, the Democratic Alliance has weighed in on this discussion, saying that this financial exclusion could see Gauteng experiencing a repeat of the Life Esidimeni saga, saying that it's that serious. Talk us through how that could essentially happen. Okay.
The whole issue is at the moment, however, that the MEC and Panyaza Lesufi, the Premier, started engaging with the non-profit organizations within Gauteng. Throughout the region, there has been regional summits to understand exactly, and the idea is to understand exactly what the issues are and how we can align ourselves to the various components that have been defined in the presidential summit, which was held at last year.
Yeah.
And that needs to filter down to all the provinces, not only Gauteng. So they have commenced with doing that engagement, but it had to be forced. And I think that forcing happened when all the non-profit organizations in Gauteng we marched, okay? We all pulled together as a unit of all the non-profit organizations and then requested the intervention of the MEC at that stage, as well as the Premier. So from there on, there was a highlight, because I hear you that there is unspent funds, but it's a two-way zone. As a non-profit organization and chairperson of a non-profit organization and working with many different organizations, there is a bit of both sides. Okay, so your Department of Social Development they do monitoring and evaluation. So they should pick up very early on in the stage that a non-profit organization is either non-compliant, have got issues. We raise that as a non-profit organization on a monthly basis because they monitor and evaluate us very, very closely. As a matter of fact, they turn every cent around. If we are out by 1 cent, we literally have to write a deviation report to say why and where is that 1 cent. So it is earlier on throughout your financial year, because our financial year, we only get funding for 1 year.
Yeah.
Okay. So at the end of March is our end of our financial year. So you fund it from the 1st of April through to the 30th of March. Okay. And most of the funding, it's actually archaic. Okay, the way department funds us, because they fund us for a social worker. In other words, the post. Yeah. They call it a post. Okay, it's a position. And then they will give us and allocate us a little bit of admin costs. Now, your cost to company does not, that little bit of money, the 3 cents, a small nyana change that we get, doesn't cover our cost to company, because we are now subjected to a point where we have to actually travel. You just read the fuel increases are coming.
Yeah,
how are my social workers going to get there? Transport is increasing. There is so much. Our living expenses are increasing daily. And I mean, post-COVID, a lot of it's actually increased. Our social issues have increased and not decreased.
So this is essentially putting you in a corner where you're going to have to make some tough decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, we need to try and find money, not when, yesterday. And we can't, because all your profitable companies that needs to then take us on as their corporate social investment, they are also closing doors. They are also taking, restructuring, because they don't have funds.
Yeah, perhaps let's pose this to Bernadine. I mean, this decision essentially means you have to source your own funding for the next financial year, because you'll no longer be part of Premier Panyaza Lesufi's elevated priorities, because he's essentially broken them down. What challenges lie ahead for you?
Absolutely everything. So one has to look at the chances of NGOs in South Africa getting foreign funding. Our grey listing classification is mitigating completely against that. Foreign funders are looking at our lack of infrastructure, load shedding, rife corruption within government departments, and really saying, I'm not sure whether I want to invest in South African NGOs. I've had foreign donors come up to me and say, well, let's sit down and discuss what's happening in your country. It's very scary. But one has to then highlight that, as opposed to, and Angelique raised it earlier, the second presidential summit on gender-based violence and femicide, where we had the private sector in the room saying they have very big pockets. They have the money to actually disperse to NGOs in South Africa, but they don't know how to do that. Government needs to bring the private sector into the room with NGOs and make sure that that happens. We had presentations from other private organizations, private sector companies, that were basically saying they had given money to government to use to support gender-based violence survivors, and that money was returned intact, unused, with the excuse used that it wasn't a vehicle for the distribution or a conduit for the distribution of those funds within government. Now, but these excuses can just not be given any sort of credence. We really need to be taken seriously. Government needs to understand that they need to act now. We cannot have the entire NGO, NPO sector crumbling because of the lack of support, lack of importance that is given to NGOs that are doing their work, and really wholly underfunding across the board. You know, shelters get approximately 31 to 39% of what they need to keep the doors open. Yeah. And we cannot continue to operate like this. Something needs to give, and it can't be us.
Yeah. Yeah. Angelique, perhaps in closing, is there room at all to go back to the drawing table and negotiate with the Gauteng MEC for Social Development and the Premier and our NPOs sort of now coming together to challenge the move proposed by the province? And also what Bernadine is raising here is really important. How then do you have a functional distribution channel which doesn't essentially result in funds being returned to Treasury?
We are currently, and like I said, you know, there were the regional summits that was held in our province. Yeah. And then on the 1st and the 2nd of August, there's another, now it's a provincial summit, because all the regions had their opportunity to provide their input. The most important part is that I hope that those the comments that was made in regional areas, because you do understand that South Africa is one of those amazing countries that even in Gauteng, each region does exactly what they want, and each municipality has their own beautiful bylaws, so there's no standardization across the whole of Gauteng. So, and I think the country, hashtag just saying, but the bottom line is that we are sitting with this issue that I hope that everything is coming together on the provincial summit. I know one of the topics that will be discussed is the budget reprioritization and the funding. So at the moment, I have, and I hope in my heart, because I'm an eternal optimist, okay, that we are going to be heard and that there is going to be a handheld, because we must remember CBOs, which is community-based organizations, non-profit organizations, are started by the community for the community. And that must not be just spread, and said, no, you cannot be funded. Because what are you doing? You're actually taking the food out of your own people's mouths.
Yeah, because
not mine.
The Premier did say poverty alleviation is one of his priorities.
Exactly.
So it all doesn't make sense now.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it will be wonderful to actually hear and come to a joint decision by the 2nd of August to get the outcome from there, because then the budgets need to be done. We all need to reapply. Our 3-year business plans that we usually submit is going to be revised. And my prayer is, don't kill our people.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Let's perhaps leave it there for now. Bernardine Abacha, Executive Board Member of NSMSA, joining us via Zoom link, and Angelique McAdam, Chair of the Gauteng Child Welfare, wishing you all the best, and that optimism perhaps leads to some success. Thank you so much for your time.